They said no one escapes the consortia, but they were wrong. Dead wrong. Under the pale light of a forgotten moon, a garden grows where warships once hunted and royal bloodlines were erased. Mateo was just a smuggler. Sira, a fugitive with secrets etched into her DNA. And the child, a living ghost of a dynasty meant to stay buried. But now, peace is blooming in the most unlikely place. A dome, a seed, a heartbeat. And just when you think it's over, he hands them the future with his dying breath of crystal, worth 1 trillion credits, and the words, "Get your family a moon. Stay with us because what comes next rewrites everything." The bar smelled of burnt metal and forgotten oaths. Somewhere between the hiss of steam vents and the stuttered thump of synthetic jazz, time folded in on itself. Epsilon 9 wasn't a place for soft things. It was the last stop before the black truly began a rusted shell, clinging to the edge of a forgotten trade lane. Drifters came here to disappear. Mercenaries came to drink. No one came to fall in love. And yet, that night, everything changed with a smile. She wasn't supposed to notice. Hell, I wasn't even paying attention. Just a polite thank you tossed to the waitress who'd managed to bring my Jupiter draft without spilling it down her own boots. She winked. It meant nothing. But the floor trembled. Slowly, purposefully, with the weight of judgment forged in 100 bloodied arenas, she rose. 3 meters of violet muscle wrapped in scarred battle plate moved through the smoky crowd like prophecy given form. Her name was Sira, and when she walked, gravity remembered itself. The air itself felt thinner, like it dared not challenge her. Her boots struck ferrocrete with a finality that silenced every drunken whisper. One by one, conversations died, glasses stopped midair, and breaths were held hostage. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her right arm moved one slow, deliberate arc of tension, and then the wall exploded. Not a crack, not a dent. Her fist tore through the techno-cement behind the waitress, embedding deep like the wrath of an ancient god. Fragments rained down like stunned birds. A glass shattered at my feet. The waitress fled, white-faced and trembling, her tray forgotten, her courage buried in the rubble. And Sira turned. Her red eyes glowed, not with rage, but something colder. Possession. "He's mine," she said flatly, like stating a fact of physics. Not loud, but loud enough to leave no room for contradiction. And that was the end of it. The bar cleared like a fire alarm had gone off. No one wanted to be in the same room as a pissed-off gladiatrix of the Kateran bloodline, unless they had a death wish and a backup clone on ice. I stayed frozen in my seat. My hands still clutched the glass, fingers damp. I remember the condensation. I remember how quiet it got. I remember my own pulse in my ears, like distant war drums. She didn't look at Menno yet. She just returned to her seat like nothing had happened. Like punching a hole through reinforced composite was a social correction, not an outburst. The booth creaked under her weight. She adjusted her arm plates, folded her arms, and finally turned her head. "Drink," she said. I took a sip, mostly to hide the way my hands trembled. I couldn't tell if I was afraid or something worse enchanted. That's the problem with aliens. Some of them break your bones. Others break your understanding of what it means to be wanted. "That wall was made of armored cement," I muttered. "I went easy," she replied without humor. "You terrified a waitress." "She winked at you." She blinked. "Number." She emitted pheromones, specific ones. "You didn't notice." "I did." I exhaled hard. My shoulders dropped. "You're impossible." "I'm yours," she said simply. And that's what undid me. Not the punch, not the drama, but the certainty in her voice. As if this wasn't a moment of jealousy. As if she wasn't confused or hurt or vulnerable. To her, I was hers like a sword, like a war story, like a relic from a battle that never quite ended. She didn't ask for permission. She never had. And 7 months ago, in the broken belly of a slave shipwreck, I made a mistake. I set her free. That night, I watched the fist that had shattered the wall rest gently beside a drink. I watched the red-eyed war machine close them slowly, knuckles scarred, claws retracted, quiet now. No one else dared to return. The bar was ours, silent but for the thrum of the generator and the distant scrape of debris settling into itself. She looked at me again. "Finish your drink," she said. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't afraid of her. I was afraid of how much I wanted her to never let go. She was never supposed to be there. The slaver wreck drifted in silence, its broken hull torn open like a rib cage, bleeding sparks into the void. It hovered between the moons of Aerodon like some ancient corpse that had forgotten how to die. Mateo had followed a beacon old, corrupted and faint. He thought it was salvage, metal, parts, something he could sell. But fate is never that kind. He landed rough. The docking clamps groaned, then gave out entirely. The floor tilted under his boots as he stepped inside the shattered corridor. The walls were scorched, bulkheads warped. Every few meters, there were signs of violence, blaster marks, dried blood, claw grooves carved into steel. The smell was the worst of it, a cocktail of ozone, decay, and synthetic adrenaline. He didn't speak, no one to speak to. Just the voice in his head counting down what he'd need to make this worth the risk. Power cells, ration packs, black market weaponry. Maybe a neural core if the bridge hadn't burned. But then he heard it. Not a scream, no, that would have been easy. It was a sound he couldn't name at first, like metal breathing, like pain compressed into rhythm. A low, soft groan that didn't belong in machines. He followed it, flashlight beams slicing through dust motes and smoke wisps. He passed empty cages. They hadn't just carried weapons here, they carried lives. The corridor opened into the cargo hold wide, dark, filled with silence that pressed against his chest. And there, beneath the shadow of a torn support beam, she was chained to the wall. Her armor was cracked. Blood trickled down the grooves in her chest plate like melted obsidian. She didn't move when he stepped closer, didn't snarl or flinch. She only watched him, one red eye half-lidded, the other blackened with bruising. Wires ran from her neck into a collar. Embedded deep beneath her skin, a control node blinked red. Explosive tether. One wrong move, and her brain would vaporize from the inside out. She was a weapon leashed to rust. And yet, she watched him like he mattered. Mateo paused. Everything in him screamed to walk away, to pretend he never saw her. This wasn't his problem. She wasn't human. And no one in their right mind crossed paths with a chained Kataran, especially not a gladiator class. They were engineered to kill entire battalions with their bare hands. But something about her, something old and buried, rose to the surface when their eyes met. He knelt. Her voice was rough, broken by dehydration and smoke. "You came for me," she said. "No," he replied honestly. "I came for scrap." She smiled, bloody teeth. "Still, you came." He looked over the collar. Complex, alien tech woven into flesh, not something you could just rip off. He studied the wiring, the blinking pulses, the security node, then reached for his belt and pulled out his toolkit. "You move wrong, we both die," he muttered. "I won't," she said. The lock resisted him at first. It was designed to. But Mateo was stubborn, and desperation was a better motivator than genius. Sweat dripped from his temple as he pried into wires that weren't meant to be touched. The final node clicked, and the collar popped loose with a hiss. And for a moment, he thought nothing had happened. Then she collapsed forward. Not an attack, just exhaustion. Her body fell against him, too heavy to hold. Her weight shoved him to the ground, but she didn't crush him. She curled there, arms still shaking, breath ragged against his chest. "I have no name," she said. He blinked. "You have no hat?" "Not anymore. They erased it. But I will give you mine. I am Sira now, and you are my eternal protectorate." He laughed, awkward, unsure how to respond. That's a little dramatic. But she didn't laugh, didn't move. She meant it. And somewhere, through the smoke and ruin, through the metallic groans of a dying ship, and the humming red of her slave implant, he realized something dangerous. She wasn't broken. She was waiting. And now that she was free, she would never forget who set her loose. He should have left her there, but he didn't. He carried her out, step by step, as the hull groaned behind them and artificial gravity failed. He dragged her across rusted floors, back to his ship, never noticing the way her fingers curled tighter around his jacket with every heartbeat. Even then, half conscious, half mad, she was already choosing him. Not because he was strong, not because he was brave, but because for the first time in a life made of blood and silence, someone saw her and chose not to run. The ship hummed low, like a beast dreaming in the dark. The wandering star drifted through uncharted quiet, wrapped in the purple haze of nebulae that flickered like dying gods. Outside the window, the galaxy rolled on, indifferent and immense. But inside, things were far more dangerous. Mateo leaned against the galley doorway, arms crossed, jaw tense. He hadn't spoken for nearly 2 minutes, letting the silence breathe between them, but Sira didn't flinch. She sat with perfect stillness, sharpening the edge of a vibroblade with long, deliberate stroke each movement, whispering through the air like a warning. "You terrified a waitress," he said finally, his voice dry but quiet. Sira didn't look up. Her voice was calm even. She exuded courtship pheromones. Mateo blinked. "She was delivering my drink." "Still mine." That was it. No apology, no twitch of guilt. Just those 2 words dropped into the air like stone into deep water. He stepped into the room, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. The blade in her hands gleamed under the cabin lights, not from polish, from blood memory. "You can't punch through walls every time someone smiles at me," he said, trying not to raise his voice. She finally looked up then, her eyes red, endless met his without blinking. I choose not to." He exhaled. Frustration burned at the edges of his thoughts, but beneath that, there was something warmer, something dangerous. "You're not jealous?" he asked, almost amused. "I'm not built for jealousy," she said. "I'm possessive. There's a difference." He stared at her for a long second. "That's not better." She tilted her head. "It is for you." He almost laughed. Almost. But he saw the way her grip on the blade had loosened, the way her shoulders, forged for war, had subtly dropped as if letting her guard down just enough to let him see it. Not fear, not insecurity, but attachment, raw and unrefined. "You do realize," Mateo said slowly, "you've declared ownership of me in 3 star systems. Only because you keep almost getting yourself stolen." "I said thank you to a waitress, Sira." She winked, and she didn't smell neutral. He stood, walking to the window, staring out at the stars, twisting into dust trails. The reflection in the glass showed her behind him, motionless, watching. "You were born for war," he murmured. "But with me, I don't know, you're different." He turned, and she stood now, setting the blade aside, her steps slow, deliberate, predatory, but not hostile. She stopped close enough for her shadow to fall over him. She didn't speak right away, just looked down at him, studying the lines of his face like he was a riddle worth unraveling. "You confuse me," she said finally. "You're not strong, not fast. You bleed too easily, you sleep too much, but you don't run, you never did." "You mean when I freed you?" "No," she said. "I mean now." Her hand rose. Not to strike, just to touch the side of his jaw, fingertips grazing skin like a blade just before the cut. Her voice dropped lower. "I was never taught restraint, never taught softness, only how to break and burn and survive. But you stand in front of me without fear." Mateo met her gaze, and something stirred behind his ribs. Not adrenaline, something older. "You say I'm yours," he said. "But what are you to me?" "I don't know," she whispered, "but I want to find out." For a moment, neither of them moved. The ship hummed around them, alive with systems and starlight. In that stillness, something passed between the unspoken, fragile, but undeniable. Connection. Real, painful, impossibly inconvenient. He leaned into her touch. She didn't pull away. And in the silence that followed, something inside both of them began to shift. Something they couldn't name yet. But it would change everything. The station was supposed to be dead. A ghost in low orbit, barely clinging to the last breath of a forgotten war. Its hull floated, half cracked, half scorched, sealed by nothing but silence in the vacuum's indifference. Mateo hovered the wandering star just beneath its broken docking collar. From this angle, the station looked like a wound in the sky, one the universe never bothered to stitch shut. They were hired by a voice, one without a face. The kind that slipped into encrypted channels like a whisper sliding under a locked door. Spectre, he called himself. No history, no coordinates. Just a simple contract. Retrieve a sealed package from the primary cargo bay, no questions asked. Payment. Enough credits to buy a moon or disappear into one. Sira hadn't liked it. She rarely liked anything that breathed too quiet or came with too many secrets. But credits talked, and they needed fuel. Inside the station, the air was stale recycled long beyond its design, thick with rust, soot, and the scent of old death. The lighting flickered in odd rhythms, like the place hadn't realized its crew was gone. Mateo walked first, flashlight high. Sira followed, silent as a thought, her boots crunching over debris that hadn't been disturbed in years. Hallways twisted like broken spines. Bulkheads hung loose on rusted hinges. Gunfire scars painted the wall some recent, some so old they'd fused into the metal. The silence wasn't peaceful. It watched. It waited. They found the cargo bay behind a door that hissed reluctantly open. The chamber beyond was a cavern of ruin. Wrecked crates, scorched floors, empty shelves, and something else. In the center, untouched, stood a single cryogenic pod, oval, smooth, and humming with faint life. Its surface was not human-made. The alloy shimmered with shifting blue, scriptancient, alien, alive. Lines pulsed faintly under its shell, like veins beneath translucent skin. Sira didn't move. Her breath slowed. Mateo stepped forward, cautious. The pod's interface glowed brighter as he neared. Temperature stable. Life signs steady. Not cargo. A person. The pod hissed, seals releasing with a sound like mourning. Cold mist spilled onto the floor, wrapping around their ankles. Sira's hand reached to her belt, but she didn't draw. Not yet. Then, it opened. Inside was a child, no more than 6, maybe younger but not entirely human. Skin pale, tinged with a faint lavender hue. Tiny glowing veins curled like circuitry under the flesh. His hair shimmered like starlight caught in motion. On his wrists, symbols marked him Kataran, old blood. The boy stirred. Eyes opened. They weren't afraid. Silver, wide, unreadable. He looked at Sira, blinked once, then reached out a trembling hand toward her armored chestplate. And he spoke. Mother? Mateo's heart stopped. Sira's expression didn't change, but her body locked like stone. The boy leaned into her, unafraid, unfamiliar, yet certain. He placed his head against her chest like he'd done it 1,000 times before. She did not move. She did not breathe. Until finally, she spoke. I'm not, she whispered, low and fragile, like she didn't believe it. The boy didn't care. He closed his eyes and rested against her. And in that moment, something inside her armor, something buried under years of pain, violence, and silence began to shift. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't training. It was something older. Something terrifying. Something maternal. Mateo looked at the readings on the pod's interface. Biometrics confirmed. Royal markers. Genetic purity unmatched. The boy wasn't just important. He was impossible. What the hell did we just walk into? He muttered. Sira didn't answer. Her hand hovered over the boy's back, hesitant, shaking. Then, gently, she held him. The universe outside the station kept spinning, unbothered, unaware. But inside that broken chamber, something new was born. Not a mission, not a bounty, but a bond. And bonds like that, they never stay secret for long. Let me know when you're ready for Scene 5, where the child's identity is revealed and the web of betrayal, empire, and war tightens around them. The night on Nova Terra didn't feel like a night. The light there was thin, filtered through a fractured atmosphere in the ruins of a collapsed system that hadn't finished dying. Storms shimmered in the upper sky, pale green flashes that lit the broken towers like bones sticking out of ash. The ground trembled, sometimes just enough to remind you it had suffered once and never really healed. They met Maeva in a checkpoint buried 3 stories beneath what used to be a governmental hall. She wore old soldier's gear repurposed with science, textile, and wires, utility stitched with survival. Her eyes were sharp, tired, knowing. When she saw the child, she didn't ask for a name. She knelt, scanned, and froze. Her breath caught not from surprise but recognition. The boy said nothing. He clung to Sira's side like a second skin, his silver eyes peeking from under her arm. He didn't flinch at strangers. He didn't cry. He simply watched, like he was waiting for someone to finally admit what he already knew. Mateo took them down a corridor that hadn't seen light in years. Behind a steel bulkhead, coated 3 times over and still humming with residual power, they stepped into a room built for secrets. Terminals flickered awake, tired machines searching themselves for memory. Sira stood with her arms crossed, shielding the child from ghosts. Mateo said nothing. His instincts screamed this was bigger than any smuggler's job ever should have been. The scan began. Blood, DNA, lineage. The data bloomed across the screen in pulses royal Cateron glyphs, rotating markers, golden rings denoting heritage status. Maeva's face didn't move, but her voice thinned. This is impossible. She typed again, and the interface stuttered under the strain. This child is not just high blood. He's synthetic. Bioengineered from preserved royal DNA. This level of precision, it's off-grid, restricted to only the highest consortia programs. She looked up. This is a resurrection. Mateo stepped forward. What do you mean? Resurrection? Maeva turned the display. On it, a name shimmered, half corrupted but still unmistakable. Kalen, last prince of House Bylar, the bloodline that ruled the Kataran Empire before it fell in flame. They bred him, she said, voice low, careful. A clone, number, a reconstruction, accelerated to a controlled age, hibernated until the moment was right. They made him as a backup, a puppet, just in case the resistance ever turned public sympathy. Sira didn't react. The boy leaned closer to her. Maeva studied her. You activated him, the genetic lock your presence, your own modifications, the device on your wrist. Sira looked down at the small hand gripping her armor. He thinks I'm his mother, she said softly. Mateo rubbed his temples. So what? We return him? Find some neutral power and hand him over? Silence. The child looked up at Sira, eyes glowing faintly, unblinking. No, she said. Why not? Because he chose me, and because I've killed for less. Mateo turned away, pacing. You do realize what we're standing on, right? This kid is a spark waiting to hit dry kindling. The consortia will burn whole systems to erase this. Sira didn't answer. Mateo stopped. We're smugglers, Sira, not rebels, not guardians of ancient dynasties. She stared at him. No, she said, but I am still a weapon, and now that weapon has a reason. Maeva stepped in, careful. If the consortia finds out, let them come, Sira said, her voice a stone dragged across iron. The weight of her words fell heavy. Not bravado, not threat. It was a vow. The child said nothing, but he smiled a small, tired smile, like a secret only he understood had just been spoken aloud. Mateo looked at both of them, and in that moment, knew there was no turning back. They hadn't stumbled into a job. They had been chosen by a story that refused to stay buried. And now they were part of it, whether they wanted to be or not. The leak didn't begin with a scream. It began with a flicker on back-channel networks, private encrypted pings, whispers among rogue satellites and data ghosts. But in less than a rotation, every corner of the outer systems lit up with a name, thought buried with a dynasty. Heir of Bylar. And it had a face. His face. A child no older than 7 standard years, cradled beneath the wing of a towering ex-gladiatrix, and watched over by a man with rust on his coat and fire in his eyes. They stood at the center of a holoframe, now passed from smuggler dens to royal warships. The consortia didn't just panic, they mobilized. On board the Wandering Star, the air was still, tense, electric. Outside, 300 vessels broke orbit in perfect silence, cloaked, but Mateo already knew. You could always feel the difference in the stars when you were being hunted. He paced across the bridge, fingers brushing the worn edge of the console. We can't keep running like this, he said. We hide him, somewhere deep, with the rebel enclaves in the spiral rift. They'll protect him, train him, keep him safe. Sira didn't flinch. Her massive frame blocked the only doorway, a silent refusal written in blood and bone. Her voice came low, steady, without room for negotiation. I will not let him go. Her hand hovered unconsciously over the boy's back. He stood close, small palms pressed into her armor. His glow barely visible seemed to pulse with her breath, synchronized like they shared something far older than time. "He is not yours," Mateo snapped. "He's a symbol. He's everything they want to erase. And if we don't disappear now, he'll be dead before the next sunrise." The words cut, but not deep enough. Not through what Sira had already decided. And yet it wasn't Sira who answered. It was him. The boy stepped forward, slow but certain. Ancient veins shimmered faintly beneath his skin, not bright, but undeniable. His voice was clear, steady, not a child's voice. "I will stay to protect you." Mateo froze. Sira's breath caught. "You don't have to," Mateo whispered. "We're the adults. You're—" But the boy shook his head. "She freed me. You sheltered me. Now they chase me. I know what I am. I know what they want. And I would rather face their blades than watch her fall again." The silence that followed was heavier than gravity. And in that pause, Sira's hand lowered slowly. Not in surrender, but in understanding. She knelt before him, massive hands cupping his face with impossible gentleness. "You are not made to fight their wars," she said, voice trembling like it had never before. "No," he whispered. "I was made to end them." Mateo looked away. He didn't want to cry, not in front of either of them. But damn it, the kid wasn't supposed to be this brave. He wasn't supposed to know sacrifice. The rebels came at nightfall. They wore cloaks with no insignias, moved like ghosts across the hangar floor. They said little. One simply looked at the boy and nodded once like he already knew what was entrusted to him. As the ship powered back up, prepping for silent departure, Sira stood at the ramp. The child reached for her. Her hand enclosed his easily, fully, but the grip trembled. "I'm not your real mother," she said, her voice cracked. He looked up. "You are to me." She turned quickly, before her resolve shattered entirely. The ramp hissed closed, and the wandering star vanished into the void, smaller now, somehow emptier. But far behind them, in the heart of a hidden base carved from forgotten asteroid rock, a prince watched the stars. And they blinked back. Not in fear, in recognition. The transmission cracked through layers of encrypted silence, like a scream through a cathedral. A distress signal, urgent, panicked, but distorted. The words barely made it through the noise, but they were enough to rip the breath from Mateo's lungs. "The sanctuary is breached. They've found him. They're coming. No, they're already here." For one suspended heartbeat, the stars outside the wandering star hung still, uncaring. Then, without a word, both Mateo and Sira moved, as if their bodies knew before their minds did. As if they'd been waiting for this. She was already arming the twin plasma gauntlets before he could finish rerouting the nav coils. Her body was calm, too calm, like the eye of something ancient and wrathful preparing to awaken. Mateo glanced over as the ship surged into warp. "They'll have a small army. Black blades, maybe worse." Sira didn't blink. "Then they brought too few." The trip took minutes, but time bent around them, thick and slow like molasses. And when they dropped out of warp above the shattered asteroid that once held the rebel refuge, the silence said it all. Smoke poured like bleeding shadow from the chasm below. Mateo landed hard, no finesse, just speed in. They hit the ground running. Cries echoed through stone corridors, scorched with plasma fire. The once hidden base now cracked open like a broken egg, insides leaking with horror. Bodies both rebel and hunter lay twisted beneath collapsed steel and alien banners. But they didn't stop, because at the heart of the compound, under a fractured dome where artificial stars still flickered against a failing sky, the child stood alone. And around him, armored soldiers moved like shadows, guns trained, voices hissing in unknown tongues. They hadn't seen Sira yet, but they would. Because when she arrived, she didn't arrive like a soldier. She arrived like wrath incarnate. Her feet slammed the scorched floor and sent cracks dancing through ferrocrete. Her roar echoed off every wall, not of fear, not of warning, but of promise. The first soldier turned in time to see her fist, and nothing more. She moved with purpose, with elegance carved from violence. Every motion was calculated ruin. One swing shattered a ribcage. One kick bent exo-armor like wet bark. Blood splashed against crumbling stone, and yet she didn't stop. Because she had bled once for this child and would burn the stars before letting him be stolen. Mateo was slower, but no less relentless. A blaster in one hand, a shock knife in the other. He fought dirty, fought with the desperation of someone who'd seen too many graves already. And as the last wave closed in, shoulder to shoulder in formation like a hammer striking fate, Mateo turned exhausted, panting, blood running from a split eyebrow and shouted, "Sira!" She didn't look back. She grabbed a fallen heavy cannon with one arm, tore it from its mount like it weighed nothing, and screamed into the void, "He is mine!" The cannon fired once. Then again, each blast like thunder made manifest. And the enemy broke. Those that could fled, the rest did not. Then, silence. Sira dropped the weapon. Mateo stumbled toward the boy. His knees nearly gave, but the child was there, arms wrapped tight around Mateo's waist, a light glowing beneath his palms as if trying to keep Mateo's heart beating with his own. "Don't die," the boy whispered. Mateo blinked. I'm not planning to." But then he realized the wounds in his side weren't bleeding. The pain was receding, and the boy's glow was dimmer. Behind them, Sira watched, silent. She had seen this once before on a battlefield long buried by history. Not healing, not medicine, but exchange. He was giving part of himself, and he was only a child. Mateo reached down, hands trembling. "Stop, please, you don't have to." The boy looked up, weary but smiling. "I told you, I'd protect you." Sira dropped to one knee beside them, her massive hand cradling them both like they were sacred. And in that moment, Mateo wasn't a smuggler, she wasn't a killer, and the boy wasn't a prince. They were something else. A family. In a galaxy burning at the edges, beneath a sky that had forgotten its kindness, 3 souls knelt in ruin and still chose each other. And that choice, against all odds, would soon shake the stars themselves. The stars outside the viewport drifted like old memories, slow, cold, half-forgotten. Somewhere beyond them, truth floated in silence, but the kind of truth that could shatter worlds if spoken aloud. The child slept, curled in a nest of dim lights in warm blankets stitched from scavenged cloth. His breathing was shallow but steady. Mateo watched him, hands clenched so tight they left half-moon scars in his palms. Sira stood behind him, unmoving. And then the door chimed. Spectre slid into the room like a rumor, black coat trailing, silver implants pulsing like forgotten constellations beneath his skin. He looked around, then whistled low. "You weren't kidding, you've got the air." He leaned close to the boy, examining the glow still visible beneath his veins. Biocrown markings, neural sync lattice. This isn't a child, he's a walking data vault. Mateo turned. "Then we need to wipe him out of every system that knows he exists." Spectre laughed, low and sharp. "You want to delete a crown-level genetic signature from the consortia's spectral core?" Mateo didn't flinch. "Yes." Spectre grinned like a man stepping into madness on purpose. "That's insane, I love it." They gathered around the main holodeble. The fortress appeared above them, a monolith of black, floating in a Lagrange point beyond regulated space. The spectral core. A quantum-locked memory vault, guarded by time-sensitive AI that could predict intrusion vectors before they even happen. "Even I can't hack this from orbit," Spectre muttered. "But there's one way." Mateo didn't like the way he said it. "You walk in, through the front. Let the biometric readers register you as an internal contractor. Once you're in, I overwrite the exit node with a falsified identity. You'll be ghosts by the time the system finishes checking." Sira stepped forward. "And the risk?" Spectre paused. "Let's say, worst case, the fortress detects a false user key and locks your neural pattern in a quantum loop. You'll relive your death forever." Silence fell like a veil. Mateo nodded. "We'll take it." They moved fast. The wandering star slipped past border beacons under a stealth signature only Spectre knew how to bend. Every light inside turned red, every breath felt borrowed. As they approached the core, the fortress shimmered like a god's tomb. Layers of crystal lattice, black stone, and a soft internal glow like a sleeping heartbeat. It hovered without thrusters, without movement anchored to space-time itself. Sira touched the boy's hand one last time before descending. "Stay hidden, no matter what." His fingers clutched hers, eyes wide. "You'll come back?" She didn't answer. The entry node opened in absolute silence. They stepped into the corridor of the dead miles of silver-black tile, seamless and humming with algorithms older than most civilizations. Everything here remembered. Every breath, every molecule. Mateo and Sira move fast, guided by Spectre's remote whispers in their comms. Next turn. Room 8, Epsilon. You'll see the vault. Upload the anomaly code, then pray. And then they were there. The vault stood in the center of a chamber that didn't look built so much as grown. Walls of light pulsed around a single pedestal, where a crystalline obelisk hovered in midair. The spectral core, cold, unfeeling, eternal. Mateo stepped forward, hands shaking. Plug in the code. One button. And every record of the child's existence, every scan, every neural tag, every trace of his bloodline would vanish, as if he were never born. Ready, he whispered. But behind them, the air bent. A pulse, a flicker, footsteps that made no sound. A voice both familiar and wrong. You shouldn't have come, Sira. She turned. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. Valor. The name was a wound. He emerged from the dark tunnel, perfect, untouched by time, a loyalist commander, once her bond partner, once dead. Not dead now. Rebuilt, reprogrammed, and carrying orders. You gave up your oath. You gave up your bloodline. You gave up me. Sira stepped between Valor and Mateo without hesitation. I found something better. He raised a weapon, not a gun, but a blade of memory itself. A neural disruptor tuned to her exact genomic frequency. This ends here. Sira didn't hesitate. She moved. Mateo didn't see most of the fight, just flashes, collisions that cracked the air, sparks flying like fireflies from the gods. And then Sira's voice in his ear, do it. He turned back to the core, pressed the command. Everything froze. Then, the obelisk shattered. The vault screamed mechanical howls, collapsing into silence. And just like that, the boy was a ghost. The fortress lights dimmed. Valor lay broken at Sira's feet. She bled from her side, but still stood. Mateo reached for her. They didn't speak. They just ran. Back to the child. Back to the ship. Back to a world that no longer had a record of who he was, but in Mateo's arms, in Sira's protection, and in a galaxy that no longer remembered his name. The boy who was once meant to be a puppet king was finally free to choose who he would become. The spectral core no longer hovered in silence, it screamed. Alarms pulsed like heartbeats gone mad. Red light stuttered against obsidian walls as if the core itself had begun bleeding. Shadows leapt and twisted. Drones dropped from recessed ceiling hatches like mechanical insects drawn to heat, their lenses locked, their weapons charged. Mateo sprinted through the corridor with the weight of death chasing each step. Sparks rained, smoke curled from ruptured conduits. Every twist of the labyrinth felt narrower than the last. Somewhere behind him, Spectre was still inside. They'd gone back. One final mission. Not to erase this time, but to expose. Buried inside the spectral core's memory vault was a ledger coordinates, names, accounts, breeding contracts, assassination orders. Not just for the boy, but for hundreds like him. Children engineered as royalty, scattered, hidden, used, forgotten. Spectre found the file node. His voice buzzed over comms, half drowned in static. Got it. Dumping the payload now. 47 terrasecs of royal rot. Every lie they fed the galaxy. You hearing this, Mateo? Loud and clear, Mateo growled, skidding behind cover as a turret tore open the corridor behind him. Good. Now run. I'll meet you at the breach gate. He didn't. The hallway exploded in blue fire. Mateo shouted his name once, twice, but only Ash answered. Somehow, Spectre crawled out of it. He stumbled through the smoke, one arm limp, half of his torso blackened. His visor cracked, his coat gone. But clutched in his hand burned into his very skin was the crystal. He found Mateo near the docking chute. Collapsed, coughing, bleeding from everywhere. His voice was a rasp, barely human. Told you, I'd love it. Mateo tried to lift him, but Spectre shook his head. No time. This is the real payload. Raw data fractal. It'll self-terminate in 72 hours unless synced. It's worth 1 trillion credits, or 1 moon, or 1 life, yours. Mateo froze. Spectre shoved the crystal into his hands. You've got the kid. You've got her. You've got more than most of us ever did. Get out. Get them a moon. And with that, he slumped against the wall. The lights flickered, then faded. And the hacker, the myth, the whisper in every shadowed net alley across the galaxy was gone. Mateo didn't cry. There wasn't time. The drones found them. Sira met them at the breach gate like a hurricane in armor. She didn't ask about Spectre. One look at Mateo's face said enough. She simply pulled him to his feet and fired over his shoulder without blinking. They moved as one, like dancers through chaos, lovers through fire, ducking under collapsing beams, vaulting across shattered platforms. Her shoulder bloodied, his ribs fractured, but they never slowed. The ship was waiting, the wandering star trembling as its cloaked hull struggled to stay hidden under the spectral core's full alert. The child was already inside, watching from the viewport with wide, ancient eyes, as if sensing something had changed in the stars themselves. Mateo collapsed into the pilot's chair. Sira slammed the ramp shut with one booted heel. The core behind them erupted one final blast, like a beast howling as its heart was carved out. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They flew. And in Mateo's hand, the crystal pulsed. Not just data, not just currency, but power. The kind that could burn empires or build something better. And that choice now was theirs. The moon was not dead, not really. It simply remembered in silence. Its surface, once scarred by war and pitted with forgotten craters, now bore rows of green fragile vines stretching from earth-colored soil. A garden, stubborn and full of life, swayed gently beneath a thin, transparent dome, humming with recycled air and quiet hope. Mateo knelt in the dirt, fingers stained black as he coaxed new roots into place. The hum of old machines mingled with the soft rhythm of watering systems, but it was the laughter, the boys' laughter, that filled the dome like light through stained glass. Kalen ran barefoot across the polymer tiles, chasing dust motes like they were fireflies. His veins no longer glowed, or maybe the light had simply gone deeper. Behind them, the sky shimmered with impossible stars. Not distant, not cold, just watching. And inside their home, half buried into the stone wall, wrapped in moss and carbon-bonded polymer, Sira stood before a reflective panel, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach. Not glowing, not radiant, just real. Strong, quiet, changed. She didn't speak as Mateo entered, only tilted her head toward the boy dancing in the garden. Mateo smiled. That weary, lopsided smile of a man who had bled, nearly broken, but found something worth breathing for again. Who'd have thought, he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Sira looked at him, not past him, not through him, but into him. Her voice was softer now. She had learned earth languages in fragments, adopted their warmth with her own cadence. You did, she said. You said we'd learn together. He stepped closer, brushing dust from her shoulder, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Just silence, the kind that didn't demand answers, the kind that let you breathe. Outside, Kalen stopped running. He looked up, eyes reflecting the stars like silver coins tossed into a black sea. The boy had asked once, "What does peace feel like?" Mateo had told him, "It doesn't feel like anything. That's how you know you're in it. You don't flinch when it's quiet. You don't expect the hurt." And here they were. No alerts. No sirens. No more fleeing through fire and steel. Just soil. Just sky. A memory of what they had survived in the slow, sacred act of choosing something better. The camera would pan upward now, if this were a story told with lenses. It would rise over the dome, catching the last flicker of a dying nebula, curling away into the dark like a sigh. And below, on that lonely moon, orbiting a world too broken to hold them anymore, a family had taken root. Not as fugitives. Not as rebels. Not even as heroes. But as gardeners of what comes next. Because survival had never been enough. They weren't built only to endure. They were meant to grow. To love. To begin again. And so they did. And so, beneath a sky no longer filled with warships, they built something no empire could erase. A family, forged not by blood, but by choice. She, once a weapon bred for war, now carried life. He, once a drifter between stars, now planted roots in lunar soil. And the boy Kylonons hunted by a galaxy, now laughed freely beneath twin moons. But peace, in this universe, is always temporary. Somewhere out there, the consortia regathers. Old ghosts stir. New threats awaken. And those who tried to bury the past will soon learn. It grows back stronger. This was never just survival. It was the birth of something greater. And if you think their story ends here, you haven't seen what's coming next. Subscribe, stay close. Because the stars still whisper, and Alien Chronicles is just getting started.